Welcome to Exploring the Mystical Side of Life with your host, Linda Lang.
Hi, this is Linda Lang from ThoughtChange.com. We are exploring the mystical side of life today. If you enjoy our conversations, please make sure you subscribe, share it with a friend. Today, I'm honored to have Paul Selig here. Paul is a channel and an author. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
Paul, for any of our listeners who don't know your work, why don't you tell us a little bit about the energies that you channel?
Well, I work with a collective of guides. They dictate books through me. I sit in a chair, I close my eyes, I hear a phrase, I speak the phrase that I hear, and then everything tumbles out on top of it. And those lectures are recorded and then transcribed, and those transcriptions become the books. So there's now 9 in print and a 10th coming soon. And they're really all the unedited, dictations of the guides that I work with. So they're coming, with a teaching and a series of teachings, in fact. And there's a very palpable energy that comes through when the guides work, and that energy seems to be very present in the books themselves. So there's an experience attached to the reading of the books, not just the intellectual exercise of reading a book.
I can vouch for that. I have read several of your books, and although they may be an easy read vocabulary-wise, because they actually work on your energy, I can feel my energy system like shifting, and I'm probably good for maybe 2 or 3 pages, depending on the topic and how many of the kind of declaration statements are in those pages. And as you continue to receive these books, are there still these energetic declarations?
They haven't stopped. They say that each text really brings the reader to a level of co-resonance with the subject and the understanding and the comprehension, on a vibrational level. And then once we acclimate, they bring the next one through. So it's an ongoing teaching. It's a teaching finally of, I suspect, the realization of the divine in form. The divine is all things. It's something, and it's not where I thought that they were going when this adventure began, back in 2009 when they dictated the first book. But in many ways, I think they were laying out a blueprint in that very first book that they've been realizing through the subsequent texts.
Anyone who wants to delve into your work, do they need to start with that very first book, I Am the Word?
It's not going to hurt. The first book really creates, I think, a vocabulary for what follows. And but what the guides have said, and they've said this in every book, that they teach in a one-room schoolhouse, and they're addressing the students who come to each text at the level of realization that they hold. So everybody's going to be met, just in different ways through the reading of the books. It's not uncommon for people to enter with the most recent book, and because they hear about it and then go back, to go back to the others.
It's like each book has layers, and you receive according to where you are in consciousness.
That's it. Yeah, that's where you are and where you'll receive.
Wonderful. So you've been channeling since 2009. Did you set out to become a channel, or how did this adventure start for you?
Well, the first book was dictated in 2009. I began opening up as a clairvoyant in around 1987, I think it was, and not quite understanding what was happening, and I studied a form of energy healing, and I discovered that when I had my hands on people's bodies, I could hear things for them. And that was the beginning of clairaudience, and then that began to develop. And now I work the way that I work. I still think that I'm improving, as I'm continue to be worked with. But no, it didn't just arrive as a great announcement of, here we are and we're going to be working through you. It was a real process of being developed as a channel and learning to stay out of the way, get out of the way and stay out of the way as best I can. And I'm grateful that it took a long time. I feel that I was trained by them and I sort of had an apprenticeship. I did a group that met in my apartment back when I lived in New York City for about pretty much 18 years. I took a couple of years off in that time. But about 18 years, I sat there with, 3 people, 10 people, whoever showed up. People would put $10 in a basket. I was a college teacher. I wasn't looking to be known for channeled work, but that's where I was developed. And my job was to continue to show up. And I did show up and I continue to. So that's been my part of the bargain.
So did you actually consciously intend to become a channel?
No, I didn't even believe in it. I thought it was a bunch of crap. I mean, I was raised an atheist, and I had a bit of a spiritual awakening in 1987, which was the beginning of opening up. And I had read half of a Seth book when I was a graduate student at Yale, and thought it was really interesting, but didn't go any farther than that. Although, in retrospect, I think it had a large effect on me. I had studied as a playwright, and playwriting was all about hearing voices and rendering voices. And without even knowing what I was doing, this is back in my early 20s, I used to put one song on, one piece of music on loop, and I would play it for hours and sit there and write. And what I was doing was inducing trance without even knowing that I was inducing trance. And in some ways, I think I just had a capacity for this. The interesting thing for me was, when the guide started lecturing through me, because initially for years I was hearing phrases, pieces of instruction, things for people specifically. But once they began dictating, lecturing, I hadn't been recording or transcribing because I don't like to hear myself channel still. I don't enjoy it. But when another medium found out that I wasn't recording, and she laid me out. So the next week I recorded and I transcribed, and I saw that it was like a 5 or 7 page lecture that required no editing whatsoever. It was beautiful. And I had been a writer with the worst case of writer's block of anybody I've ever known in my life. And it was a source of great shame for me. So I was thinking, wow, 5 pages, 7 pages, no editing, this is amazing. And every week I was curious as to what would come, what would happen next. And it continued to happen. This evolved, and I began to get behind it through the consistency. What I didn't know, which was curious to me, because I also have a practice as a psychic, and I'm not somebody who grew up thinking of himself as psychic, but I'm a radio, I'm a switchboard radio, so I turn the dial to the guides, and they can come through. But if I'm reading for somebody and say you've been estranged from, say, your son for the last 5 years, you give me your son's name, I can tune into his station. And I might start to look like him or sound like him and use his phraseology. And I can broker these higher conversations. So it was a little like the playwriting. I just didn't know that I could actually do it with real people, which was fascinating to me. And it still is. And it's one of the things that, helps me to trust this enormous volume of material that's come through. I mean, there are 10 books now. They're all about 300 pages in manuscript form. Some are longer. It's thousands and thousands of pages, plus all of the other lectures and workshops that they do. And I'm fascinated by it, but I don't think of myself as extraordinarily spiritual, or progressed. I really don't. I wish I did. I do my best, but I'm the guy who shows up for the work in hand, and this seems to be the work that I've been given to do.
Well, it is apparent reading your books how the guides actually take the comments or the thoughts that you're thinking. So it must be almost like your consciousness is set aside, that they can still monitor those thoughts. And there are doubts and freakouts sometimes.
I've got all these books out that have my name on the cover that I didn't write. And I do feel a quiet sense of responsibility to to the content. Not that I consider myself the author, but I do think of myself as a collaborator because they're being spoken through me and they are interrupting my normal process. When I channel, I'll usually do this sort of lengthy prayer protection that I just do because it allows me to recede. And I imagine climbing into the backseat of a car very often and turning the wheel over to the guides. But I'm in the backseat and I'm still half listening. So if they were to say, and yes, the moon is indeed made of green cheese, I would likely move up to the front and say, hey, wait a minute, you have to explain this. And so my interruptions are when I'm thrown by something that they say, or that I'm trying to understand something, or I may have misunderstood something. And very often they'll take my comments. Initially, in the very first book, my interruptions just ended up in the text as their responses. I think in the very first book, they said something like, this is not a book that's been written before. And I thought, well, what about like A Course in Miracles? And they said, this is not A Course in Miracles, in response to my thought. But we didn't know in those days to footnote or say Paul said. Now they handle it and they say, Paul has a question, Paul is interrupting. And they'll speak the interruption and then it's included. And sometimes they'll say Paul is interrupting and we'll take his question later and it's the end of me for a while. And I actually kind of appreciate when that happens because it just reminds me that they're in control of the lecture and that it is their material, not mine, and I'm not supposed to understand it necessarily. And you know, usually I do eventually.
It shows us your humanity as well.
Well, I'm glad for that. You know, I tend to have a mild distrust of people who show up and announce themselves as awakened. And I don't know that being a psychic necessarily has anything to do with somebody being spiritually evolved. I really don't. I think it's a gift or a capacity or an ability. I mean, if I was 6'7", I'd be playing basketball. I would be channeling. I would be built for something else. I'm built for this. And, but I show up as Paul, and I've learned that, over the years. I mean, initially, when I was very young, and I was in my early 30s, and this was beginning to happen, I got very attached to the idea of specialness, and that's a trap for anybody. It doesn't work, finally. And, fortunately, I think I outgrew most of that early on. But you do that by getting knocked on the head a few times. And what I found with this stuff is you're going to get knocked around if you try to mess with it. So, keep it clean.
I agree. It's interesting you say that because I was reading today in the Book of Truth, which is one of your channel books, about how, there is God or source, whatever you want to call it, in absolutely everything that's created in every person. So there isn't one better than the other. And as soon as you think there is, you are in separation, right?
That's what they say. And it's a challenging teaching, but I agree with it. It's true. It's just not convenient and it's not what the ego wants. And, but it doesn't make a difference. I mean, the guides have said there is one note sung in the entire universe, and everything in manifestation is an articulation or manifestation of that one note at a different level of tone or resonance. So we're all of the same great sound. You can call that the word, which is what they named it in the very first book, the energy of the creator in action. But, this is just what they say. And I find that because the teachings generally come with an experiential component, a practicum with the energy that they work with, that people can have for themselves, that solves a lot of problems, because if you can feel it for yourself, you can trust it. I don't want people deferring to me. I'm just not interested in it. But if they have their own experience of the work, that's great. Then they can trust their own experience, and that's valuable in a different way.
So do you use the declaration statements that the guides give, like separate from your channeling? Do you use them in your personal life?
Yeah, I do. More, I think, than I used to for a long time. Now it's just something that I do quite naturally. when I remember or when I'm not. Like if I want to be cranky and if I want to be nasty and I want to do those things, I have free will. I can do that. I know the ramifications of it on my energy field in my life, so I can run with whatever I want to. But if I'm mindful and I use these things, the benefits are fairly immediate. It's just a shift in the energy field. It's a shift in my focus. It's in some ways giving things over to source. When you claim, I am worn through this frustration, or I am worn through this pain, or any of the claims that they've given in the books, there's usually a physical affect that can be experienced.
And for anyone who has not read any of your material, Paul, maybe we should define that word when we declare I am word.
Well, the guides are sort of reappropriating, I think, words that they feel have been misused or misinterpreted over time. So their definition of the word was the energy of the creator in action. And when one of their first attunements, the very first attunements, and this they brought through when I was about 33 years old back in New York, and I didn't know what the heck they were talking about. But it was the attunement to the energy of the word, which they still work with, in every workshop. Although there are other attunements on top of that or that follow that. Their definition of Christ has always been the aspect of the creator that can be realized in material form. They don't speak of it necessarily as a personage. They speak of it as the monad or the divine spark that seeks, resurrection or articulation through us. And that's much of their work. Much of their work seems to be about the realization, which is the knowing of the inherent divine in manifestation. As all things, they say that humanity's only real problem is the denial of the divine. They say what you damn damns you back, and what you bless blesses you in return. Who you put in darkness, what you put in darkness calls you to that darkness. That's a teaching of Vibration Lacordaire. And so they seem to be trying to show us who and what we are in manifestation at a higher level of tone or resonance that they say then calls to it that which it's in alignment with. So they say this is how a new world is called into being. It's not a selfish teaching, really, and it's certainly not a teaching of the divinization of the ego. It's not that at all. I mean, they've said things like, you don't become the Christ becomes you, or the divine expresses as in through you. It's not about getting everything you want. It's about realizing who and what you are, and realizing, I suspect, what the source of all things are, which is not what we've been taught culturally.
Well, you say it's just one little thing that's kind of off kilter, but it's a big thing.
It's everything. It's how we know our world. And they say, we're in this agreement to separation, which is we're separate from our source, and we're separate from the people around us and the country next to us, and all of those things. And what that's created is more evidence of separation. And that's our creation, the guides say. In fact, we're not separate, but we just think we are. And you move to a higher level, and that experience begins to change.
So is there a plan to remember our unity consciousness? Is that like part of our agreement?
I hear that, yeah. I mean, the guides said in the very first book, back in 2009, when it was dictated, they said, humanity is at a time of reckoning. And a reckoning is a facing of the self and all of one's creations. And that's individual creations and collective creations. And they've been unpacking that in all of the books that follows. And they've been rather prescient in terms of what they've talked about, in terms of what we've seen sort of happen in our collective experience of world. But they started to say about a year ago that humanity has decided collectively that we're moving to the next level, so that this is positive, that we've realized what we will get if we continue to play out the current scenario, which is, they say, culminates in war. That's unfortunately what we're calling to ourselves if we continue as we have. And they said, and they said this like in the first book too, I said that the idea that you could build more powerful or bigger bombs to keep the peace is just ridiculous, because bombs are intended to be used finally. And that stupidity, I think it's stupid, will be understood. So hopefully we don't have to understand that by seeing them used. But they've said that we're going to make it. But they do say, and they've been saying this, pre-COVID. I mean, I was living in New York City, and they started to say, get ready, there's something really big. And this was in public live streams. And they don't teach gloom and doom at all, but it was like, get ready, there's something really big going to come. New York's going to be seriously affected. And I was like, wait a minute. I was in New York. I lived downtown during 9/11. I lived in the Village during the AIDS epidemic. I don't want to do this again in New York. I said, please just let me be someplace pretty and not in Manhattan. And then I ended up in Hawaii, which is, it's the craziest thing in the world. I never thought I would have ended up here. But they're pretty on it. And I think they're saying that all of the things that we're dealing with, it's like they call it a tidal wave of change. When we're being carried, they say, to a higher shore through it. It's just not always going to be necessarily comfortable or pleasant or what we want to see as we move through it.
So true, so true. Paul, the ancients have given us kind of a timeline for change. A lot of the ancient wisdom teachings say kind of 2012 to 2032 timeframe. Have the guides given you any kind of insight that way?
They said it not too long ago. I think it's, they said 4 generations it will take for manifestation of the new to be fully born. But that's not really long. I don't think a generation's, 20 years or something? So I don't know what a generation is, but I don't read the other teachings. So I buy everybody's books and I never crack them. And it's been that way from the beginning. I just try to keep what the guides are bringing through clear.
I think that time frame is like the greatest change. So it could make sense to have it fully integrated, that it would, take a little bit longer. Do you have any suggestions for the listeners to really keep their centeredness and to tap into their own spirituality?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that the guides say which I find helpful and that I do manage to try to live by. And they often say that the action of fear is to claim more fear, and every choice we make in fear contributes to all the fear that is. So don't take actions based in fear, but they do make a distinction between fear and prudence. Prudence is, if there's a sign by the water saying sharks, that's maybe not to go in the water that day. It's not that you're frightened of the water. You don't want to get eaten by a shark. So I live by that. And again, the simple stuff, here's the other one. You can't be the light and hold another in darkness. It's just not possible. And it's the height of hypocrisy. And it's, the problem with most of our religions, which is us versus them. So I do my best with that as well. You can't be the light. You can't hold the light and keep another in darkness. The action of the light is to illumine, not to refuse. You can't refuse God in another, so that's all.
I think there is a declaration series when you're having challenges with someone.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
The one that comes to my mind is, I know who you are.
Oh, yeah.
I know what you are. I know how you serve.
Yeah, it's pretty effective. You see, and you're speaking, it's the true self who knows, the divine self who knows who the other is. So you're not having to pretend. You're claiming, I know who I am at that level as the divine. I know what manifestation and how one serves is expression. So I know who you are. I know what you are. I know how you serve. The guides call it a claim of truth. And they say what is true is always true. And this is always true because the essence of the divine is present as all things, including the one you can't stand. Okay, that's where we start to grow, is when we can know that in the person we're not very fond of in that moment. Paul,
how is the channel process for you?
I whisper and repeat. It's how it started. When it first started, the very beginning, I used to feel as if somebody had their lips pressed against my forehead, and you were feeling the vibration of the words, and my lips would form the words as I would feel it. So there was this slight delay. And at the beginning, it could have been yeses, which was a Y, and a no, which was an And I was working in my apartment, and I wasn't mic'd. There was no system. So the repetition became initially necessary. But if you think of it, it's like the whisper is the transmission, and the repetition is still in that energy, but it's expressed for others as the next phrase is coming in. So if you think I'm reading fortune cookies, like one after the next, like hundreds of them. And I don't even know, because I hear in phrases, I don't know how the whole sentence unfolds or the paragraph or the book until I see it on the page. That's my experience. So I retain maybe a third of what I've just said.
Consciously,
truthfully. I mean, I may be integrating far more, but my job is to keep up. Some people think of channeling as just sort of anything that's inspired. And I think of channeling a little differently. I think inspired art, anything is extraordinarily high. I don't discount it. Channeling to me is dictation, it's stenography. That's it. It's not about getting my little filigree in there. Occasionally I may offer a word that I'm thinking to the guides, and they'll say in the text, or if you wish, and then they might add my word, they'll give me a nod. But it's very clear whose text it is. And that's how it needs to be, I think, for it to be authentic. The guides, this is the guides' books. I think it's important. A wrong word can change the meaning of a sentence, and, it can be wrongly interpreted. And if they said it one way, that's probably the way.
they're beautiful books, to be sure. Could you give us just a little, peek under the hood for the new book coming out?
I don't remember it. It was dictated fast, like over 8 weeks or something. Fast. And I had to convene a group to do it, and some of them were done in a retreat that I held. And so it's really the next step. They're talking about the resurrection of the inherent divine as form, as manifestation. It's the first book in what they're calling the Manifestation Trilogy.
Everything has vibration. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, Paul.
Thank you.
If people are interested in reaching out, learning more about your work, how can they find out?
My website, which is just my name, it's Paul Selig, PaulSelig.com. Everything's up there. Events, live streams, books, readings, it's all there.
Thank you for taking the time out today to chat with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening to this week's edition of Exploring the Mystical Side of Life. You will find all of our conversations on YouTube, Apple Podcast, on Spotify. Come visit me at thoughtchange.com and learn what energy medicine can do for you. Pick up your copy of Learning to Listen so you can start tuning in to the guidance coming through for you. Remember to subscribe and share it with a friend. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.